I think there's two things going on. I think there's more awareness of what it takes to be off grid. And then the other is some of these tiny houses are getting larger and larger. Uh,
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and this is episode 174 with Sean Burke. The first time I met Sean, he was sketching tiny houses in a sketchbook at a speaker dinner after a tiny house conference, and I'm so glad to have him on the podcast all these years later. Sean is an active member of Tiny House Engage, my online community where he does monthly design reviews of various members' tiny house designs, and he is a professional architect. So we are going to talk about his design philosophies as well as the tiny house that he is just about finished building. This is a home that he designed and then built himself. We'll talk about how to build affordably in 2021 and beyond, some ways that tiny houses can go wrong, and a whole lot more. So I hope you stick around for the interview because it's a good one. I'd like to tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Precision Temp. Precision Temp is making one product to solve two issues that I know everyone deals with in a tiny house: running out of hot water and heating your tiny house. Precision Temp has made the amazing Twin Temp Junior propane tankless water heater, which provides unlimited hot water for your tiny house and hydronic heating. This means you get warm, heated floors so there are no cold spots. It's designed specifically for tiny houses and features whisper quiet operation as well as high efficiency. If you want more information on how Precision Temp can help make living tiny easier and more comfortable, visit precisiontemp.com. While you're there, use the coupon code THLP for $100 off the Twin Temp Junior plus free shipping. That website again is precisiontemp.com, coupon code THLP for $100 off the Twin Temp Junior plus free shipping. Thank you so much to Precision Temp for sponsoring our show. All right, I am here with Sean Burke. Sean Burke is a registered architect in Washington State and has a passion for resilient design. He is an advocate of design-based activism and housing justice. Sean has been a presenter at the Tiny House Jamboree in Colorado on the topic of designing for wellness. He's an organizer of a local tiny house meetup group and has volunteered time to help others build. He currently works remotely for an international architecture firm from his own tiny studio and can be often found baking sourdough pizzas just north of Seattle in the scenic Pacific Northwest. Sean Burke, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Glad that you could be with us.
Yeah.
I guess my first question for you is, what is resilient design? Can you kind of define that for us?
Sure. I sort of liken it to the next step in thinking regarding sustainable design.
Okay.
If sustainable design is all about finding things that are on balance with nature,
Uh-huh.
resilient design is doing two different things. It's going beyond that a little bit, looking at being net positive, not just carbon neutral, but net positive, for instance,
Okay.
but also being climate positive,
Mm.
ecologically positive, as well as being able to adapt to changing situations around you. You know, we're seeing extreme heat, we're seeing extreme flooding in parts of the world as well. And so, different ways of being able to address those sorts of topics,
Wow.
specifically focused around my interests are focused around housing, but
Mm-hmm.
in my day job, we do a lot of different building types. We work on, corporate offices. We work on hospitals, university, projects, things like that. They're all quite large.
Yeah.
On contrast, I wanted to when I started working on designing this space, you know, this is the smallest space I've designed that has come to be.
Nice. Well, that's there's so much there just in resilient design that I want to talk about. I mean, what immediately came to mind is, somebody puts solar panels on their house and they spin the electric meter backwards so they actually feed the grid.
Right.
But I'm guessing when you think about it from a design perspective from the very start, you can do a lot more than just just spin the electric meter backwards.
Yeah, for sure. You're thinking about things in terms of like where are the materials coming that we're sourced to build the project,
Hmm.
how it uses concepts like biomimicry to kind of use some of the natural systems that deal with changing seasons and weather and reimagining those systems as the built environment. It could potentially, change the way that buildings look, but also how they behave.
Cool. How does that play out in tiny house design? Because I would imagine that there are some limitations with a tiny house of what you can do in that area in that arena.
Right, right. And some of the most exciting design opportunities are when you have lots of constraints. Obviously, tiny house on wheels, which is what my platform is built on. You've got the dimensions of that frame
Yeah.
and maximum heights and that sort of thing. So, what can you do within those bounds that's both creative and inspiring to the occupants, as well as, you know, reduce your energy consumption, for instance? So, one of the examples of that is I've next to me here. I don't have any of the artificial lights turned on today, even though it's a very overcast day and it's unseasonably cold out.
Huh.
Even though Pacific Northwest had massive heat waves recently, we got our first rain in the last, I don't know, 5 weeks or so.
Oh wow.
So most of the daylight that's coming in is coming from my what I'm calling the nook, which is a little window seat area, and it's the window is 5 foot by 5.5 foot tall, single opening with double insulated glass.
Hmm.
And in my current situation where I'm parked now, it's not ideal as far as orientation to the sun. But the idea is that in the wintertime, that would be where most of the light would be coming in. And there's a slight overhang over that window to block the sun in the summer so that you don't get the direct, heat gain.
Yeah. Cool.
So we get the benefits of natural light, but it's sort of it's responding to its environment.
Awesome. One thing that I'm kind of thinking about is like, as in the midst of all these crazy climate events that are now becoming commonplace, we have to start thinking about, what will the climate be in 10 or 20 years? Because, this building that I'm building now will certainly still be standing then. And, you know, are my insulation needs different, or do I need to think about, is it going to get too hot? But we've been doing that in tiny house on wheels design for a while because the house could be moved and we need to potentially design for a different location.
Yeah, exactly. My current, situation where I'm parked with two other tiny houses. So there's three
Uh-huh.
of us in a little caravan circle, which is great. It's very community building,
Hmm.
right? And the thought is that this could be parked in the mountains or at the ocean
Hmm.
in the future. And so I had to think about, okay, what what happens in winter when you're actually in a mountain and you're getting, more snow versus being in a more of a marine environment.
Yep.
So, yeah, having to plan what that wall system is going to look like, how it's going to both keep out the weather and also deal with any moisture and vapor
Hmm.
that might be generated from inside. So I thought about a lot of those things. So there's a lot of systems that are built in. Many of them are quite opaque to people when they first come into the tiny house because I've made the technology kind of disappear. So, you can see like the walls are all paneled with thin plywood
Yep.
and reveals. And so some of those are actually, like the old sci-fi TV shows where there's like a little panel in the ship
Yep.
and they pop it off and there's stuff back there.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hide as much of that as I could to to sort of make it feel like a neutral space, and it can transform to whatever the needs are of the use.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Bento Studio,
Sure.
and that is the name of your tiny studio.
Yeah.
We met, I don't even remember how many years ago, but many years ago at a tiny house conference. And I remember that you were sketching at dinner with the other presenters. You were sketching tiny houses in a little notebook. So this has been a long time in the making, right?
It's been a long time in the making. This is not the first one that I've started.
Okay.
This will be the first one that I've finished.
When you say started, you mean you've actually started building tinies and then decided not to?
Well, I had a a life opportunity that I could not pass up, which presented itself to me in
Uh-huh.
2016, late 2016.
Okay.
The company I worked for had an opening in their London office, and I was halfway through building my original tiny house, which was called Bento Box, and it was a shipping container conversion,
Okay.
so a little bit larger than this one. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and there's some things that I would have done differently had I designed that now. But when that opportunity to move to London came up, I was like, do I stay and finish the tiny house, or do I, get someone else to put it in storage?
Yeah.
So ultimately, I took the job opportunity. I moved there for 3 years. I sold that as it was, and then a couple bought it, and I moved it to Oregon.
Cool.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to it since, though.
All right. Yeah, that's
Lost touch with
I was
that.
about to ask you, do you know what happened to it?
I have no idea. No idea.
All right.
Yeah. So when I came back here, it was actually 3 weeks before Washington State went into lockdown.
Oh boy.
So last February was when I moved back to home, the same property. I'm living with. I'm sure you know who they are. Maybe your listeners do as well. It was Chris and Melissa Tack.
Yep.
They built their tiny house about 10 years ago, and they lived in it for about 4 or 5 years on a farm. They had rented some property, and then I had met them at a book signing or a tiny house conference in Portland or North
Yep.
Carolina or one of the many, right?
One of the many.
And so we became fast friends, and they invited me to come here on the property and add my tiny house to their little collection.
Nice.
So yeah,
You gotta love when tiny house parking finds you instead of the other
exactly.
way
I
around.
was I was shocked,
It's
honestly.
something that so many people struggle with.
Yeah, 'cause I was in North Seattle originally with the first one, building
Yeah.
it in a family member's driveway.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and actually, Melissa was a guest on the show, which that would be episode 98. We talked about how the tiny house helped to kind of support the growing family, and then continues to support them through Airbnb income, or at least at the
For
time of
sure.
recording, it did. And that would be episode 98. So if anybody after this one, obviously, they can go to thetinyhouse.net/098 and hear our conversation with Melissa. And I think she even mentions that somebody's building a tiny house in her backyard right now. So the Bento Studio,
Yeah.
just by the name, I'm assuming that it is not where you live?
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
I'm calling it a studio for many different reasons. I could have called it a tiny house.
Uh-huh.
I could have called it, um, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think of like the word studio kind of evokes a certain emotion in a lot of people. You think about it in terms of an urban loft or a place where you can go to create art or
Yeah.
or y- you know host workshops or just kind of it becomes very flexible, right?
Yeah.
And I also didn't want to build a loft to sleep in, so
Mm-hmm.
I wanted it to be very open space. The great room to the right of me here is like 7 feet by 10 feet if you count the little extension of the nook.
Uh-huh.
So it's quite large and it's 9.5 feet tall. So you get lots of room and everything. And the sofa will basically just be a
Uh-huh.
pull out bed.
Cool.
So I wanted a place where I could do architecture, I could do art, I could play music. If someone wanted to use it to teach a yoga class, great. But yeah, I'll be moving into it in just a couple of weeks.
Awesome.
It's just fit and finish kind of stuff to do, interior paneling and some siding. And that's basically it. Some of the storage solutions will come later. I've got some kind of hidden compartments to build, but
Awesome.
yeah,
And what is the overall length of the Bento Studio?
it's on a 14-foot trailer that
Uh-huh.
was built by Iron Eagle in
Okay.
Portland. Great quality. Its maximum capacity is 10,000 pounds.
Nice.
It's about 110 square feet finished, and it feels a little bit larger than the 14-foot trailer because there's a cantilever off the back for the nook, and then also the front edge of the where the kitchen is over the tongue of the trailer. That wall slopes forward at uh, an angle that matches the roof, so it's a
Cool.
single shed roof that goes over the whole thing as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
And the budget for it, not including the future upgrades to put solar panels or things like that, but as it will be in the next couple of weeks,
yeah.
the budget was 30,000 for materials, not including my labor. But that number was selected because it's less than the average rent of a one bedroom flat in London
For the year.
the year. Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, the idea is that this thing pays itself off pretty quickly,
Right.
and I get a place where I can work, uh, live, and cook and entertain.
That's awesome. And so were you able to complete it under budget?
I haven't added up all the receipts yet, and I was
Okay.
really good at first, like
Yeah.
like everyone. You put them all and you categorize them and things like that. So they're in a digital shoebox right now. They're
Yeah.
inside of Notion, and I need to actually get them into a database to
Yeah. Yeah.
separate out all the costs. But I think it's pretty close.
That's awesome.
I mean, the cost of lumber really, really skyrocketed last year.
Yeah.
And most of my, besides the framing,
Yeah.
all of the interior finishes are plywood or maple or, things that are available local.
Yeah.
Um, but they use smaller caliber trees. So those prices didn't really go up as much as like, heavy timber kind of construction,
Yeah.
which is some of the stuff that we're trying to do now to be more sustainable in my day job.
Yeah.
So we're seeing that. Yeah.
Can you this is like a really nerdy question, but I've having been around, well, having built one and then having been around tiny houses for almost 10 years now and seeing tiny houses that are a few years old having issues. I'm curious if you could walk us through your building envelope, like what insulation you used, what sheathing, what house wrap, all that kind of stuff. And just maybe if you could talk a little bit about why you chose what you did.
For sure. Yeah. I know a number of my colleagues are certified in the passive house standard,
Okay.
which is something that I know you've talked about on with some of your other guests.
Yeah.
I'm trying to build it to passive house kind of standards, which is exceeding the the most stringent local codes here. I'm not actually in the city of Seattle, but in case I ever needed to park it there and
Uh huh.
get it, you know, permitted back, I wanted to exceed their energy code in Seattle. So in order to do that, I had to think about one of two different paths. There's either a prescriptive mode or a performance based mode.
Okay.
Prescriptive mode says, your floors have to be whatever RX and walls have to be R22 or
Mm-hmm.
ceiling has to be R38 or something like that.
Wow.
So I kind of went with the prescriptive mode because I didn't want to spend the additional monies to do performance based testing and come in here
Right.
with a blower door test and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So I got it kind of like for a first time, build. I've been drawing this kind of stuff for years.
Yeah.
I've been, working in the field of architecture for 27 years now. But the first time I've actually physically put everything together. So I had to
Uh
do
huh.
a lot of research. And one of the resources that I turned to first to figure out what materials I should use
Uh huh.
was I went to the 475 high performance building website.
Yeah.
And so I got a lot of materials from them. So the interior air barrier is vapor permeable in
Mm-hmm.
one direction. That's in Intello X is the name of
Yep.
that product. It's very heavy and it's perforated to allow moisture to come through so that if water gets into the wall system, it can dry both to the inside and then the outside has Mento 1000 for the entire wrap, the house wrap.
Okay. And that's also vapor permeable, but out.
But out, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it stops rain from coming in, but if vapor gets trapped behind it, it can escape.
Okay.
And it's wood frame construction, and everything is tied to the trailer, and the
Mm-hmm.
roof is tied down with hurricane ties. The insulation is primarily, I wanted to avoid foam wherever I could
Mm-hmm.
and avoid direct contact of wood to the trailer wherever I could,
Mm-hmm.
because those are places where moisture can get trapped. So it's rock wool just about everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
except for there's 1 inch of polyiso board between the framing and the trailer
Okay.
on the bottom.
Just sandwiched in there.
Yeah, it's just sitting because there's basically a metal pan that's installed, galvanized metal pan that's installed over the framing members of the trailer when they
Mm-hmm.
deliver it. That's an option that they provide,
Yeah.
and that prevents any pests from coming up in living in your floor. And so because that's all metal, I didn't want my floor joists to just rest right on that.
Yeah.
So I put down the foam first, then I laid in my floor joists, and they're all
Mm-hmm.
tied to the horizontal supports on the perimeter, the rim
Yep.
joists on the perimeter of the trailer. So everything's hung off of that. Yeah, that's pretty much the envelope, and then everything that goes beyond the envelope is there's strapping over the rock wool. There's
Okay.
rigid board rock wool on the outside, so that you've got a rain screen system. So there's the 2x4 construction
Yep.
with the weather barrier, and then there's another 1.5 inch of rock wool board on the outside of that to get your R value up to where it needs to be.
Got it.
And then there's strapping on the outside of that, and then the siding is attached.
Okay. So that rock wool board your sheathing, or is the strapping that does the sheathing?
No, there's actually plywood sheathing,
Okay.
tongue and groove plywood sheathing on the
Okay.
outside for shear strength. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. So that's quite a sandwich of layers.
It's a big wall system, and on
Yeah.
the interior, because I didn't want to bury all of my plumbing pipes and my electrical inside of the wall system
Hmm.
and have that both take up, all the junction boxes take up precious insulation space.
Yeah.
I built a service cavity on the inside.
Wow.
So there's strapping on the interior too before that siding goes up, before the interior paneling goes up.
Fascinating.
So it's between 3/4 and an inch and a half, depending on what's there.
Yeah. So can you say what the passive house wall R value is again?
Uh, it
Or
depends on where
okay,
you are in the world,
but for where you are.
but the most important part of the passive house standard is controlling airflow so that it's not you don't have leaks
Yeah.
so the envelope's very tight.
Yeah.
So the Intello X air barrier on the interior is one of the most critical components to get right.
Right. You can't accidentally pierce it.
You can't pierce it when you're putting in your electrical and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why the strapping is there. So then if the strapping is regularly spaced, then
Hmm.
if I wanted to hang a picture on the wall, I could do that as long as the nails were not too long, and then they're not going to puncture the air barrier.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And then there's active ventilation. So there's a Lunos E squared system. So one is pushing air in, the other one's pushing air out.
Right. Right. And that becomes very, very important in a tight build as well.
Yeah. And when the weather's nice, I turn that off. I open the windows.
Yep. Yep. So forgive me if you said this already. Did you go over width, or are you 8.5 on the outside?
8 foot 5 3/4.
Wow. So it's, you know, it must be a fairly small space on the inside, after those, thick wall assemblies and then the service cavity.
It doesn't feel that thick or that small inside.
Hmm.
So I've got 7 foot clear
Okay.
in the great room. And then in other places where I didn't need to build the service cavity, it's part of the cabinet. And there's a lot of cabinetry, on this side.
Yeah.
And I built the bathroom, kind of as if it was a cabinet as well. So it's not framed in, it's just 3/4 inch plywood that's framed to the floor and to its supports above.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, like the interior of a tiny house build is just like one giant cabinet job.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's why it takes so long.
Yeah. So, yeah. How long, when did you start construction of the Bento Studio?
1 year and 1.5 weeks ago on July 7th.
All
I
right.
think. Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. The winter time I really slowed down because
Yeah.
it's just tough
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, very cool. Congratulations. I've been
Thank you.
enjoying seeing photos of it. You're actually a member of Tiny House Engaged,
Yes.
and so it's been cool to follow your progress there. And you've actually been doing some of the most popular events in the community, I would say, are design reviews, where you actually, take a look at somebody's design, whether it's a sketch on a piece of paper or, a full-blown SketchUp model, and kind of talk through it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the sponsor for today's show, Precision Temp. One of the hardest things about being in my tiny house in the winter is that the floors are really cold. And I could have solved that problem by adding more insulation, but the reality is that a tiny house on a trailer is always going to have cold floors, or much colder floors than you're used to if you are coming from a house that has a basement or is even built on a slab. So the Precision Temp Twin Temp Junior propane tankless water heater can actually help solve this problem, because you can install heated floors in your house. and you can do it with the same appliance that provides you with unlimited hot water. So the Twin Temp Junior really does solve two issues with one appliance, which, let's be honest, in a tiny house, space matters, cost matters, and just being more intentional. So you get to use one appliance for two purposes. Right now, Precision Temp is offering $100 off the Twin Temp Junior plus free shipping when you use the coupon code THLP at checkout. Head over to their website, precisiontemp.com, for more information on how Precision Temp can help make tiny living easier and more comfortable. And while you're there, be sure to use the coupon code THLP for $100 off the Twin Temp Junior plus free shipping. Thanks so much to Precision Temp for sponsoring our show. I'm curious if there are any trends that you're seeing in tiny house design, or any things that you kind of have noticed have been changing and that are manifesting themselves in current tiny house builds.
I think there's two things going on. I think there's more awareness of what it takes to be off grid successfully. Whether your goals are the environment or just for your own comfort. I think just in general that is becoming more and more popular. And then the other is some of these tiny houses are getting larger and larger, uh, to the point where some folks are building them as if they're fifth wheels, 30-40 feet long, and
Mm-hmm.
the budgets are skyrocketing as well. But I think in some ways that's kind of keeping pace with the trends of real estate in general.
Yeah.
Like here, when I first moved to the Washington State area, um, I don't know, almost 15 years ago, real estate was high, but it was still within reach for many, I should
Mm-hmm.
say.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's gotten crazy. I think the average cost of a house back then was in Seattle was about $475,000,
Yeah.
and now it's close to 900.
Wow.
That's the average cost. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
So $30,000 is like the taxes for 1 year on a.
yeah,
No,
pretty
well, maybe
much.
no. Yeah.
It's not even a deposit. Yeah.
Yeah. Not even deposit. And that's, I think that what I've noticed is that it is still possible to build a tiny house affordably, especially if you do the work yourself and you don't think about paying yourself for that time that you've spent just in
Right.
dollars outlaid. You can
Right.
still do it affordably, but a lot of times you see a trade-off between the performance of the building and the quality of the materials
Mhm.
in order
Mhm.
to hit that less expensive house goal.
Yeah.
And I think what's really great about the Bento Studio is that you are building it to very high standards and using high performance building materials. Those
Mm.
the Mento and the Intello X are both, high performance, and also they're not cheap
No,
building
no.
materials.
And when you have to buy a second roll, you're like,
Oh, yeah.
I should
Can
have
you
planned
sell
better.
can you sell the rest of the roll?
Yeah, we're trying to, as a collective here, we're trying to
Yeah.
determine what to do with some of the leftover materials. Like
Yeah.
what's our next project?
Build
But you're right.
a passive chicken coop.
Yeah, we have a fancy workshop next door,
Yeah.
which is where a lot of the tools are stored because there's no garage on the property. But
Okay.
what I will say is that I'm only building this for about maybe 10% more if you adjust for inflation than
Uh-huh.
the tax built their house for.
Oh,
I think theirs was around 22,000, which would be in today's dollars about 25 to
okay.
26.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it doesn't cost a lot more to do a high performance building when it's this small,
Yeah.
because those systems only take up so much space. And I didn't go for triple pane windows from some fancy company in Poland, like a lot of
Yeah.
people have been doing, because the really high end kind of passive house certified windows are very expensive.
Yeah.
So I kind of went with an upgraded Marvin window, which is, it's a beautiful window. It's wood on the interior and clad aluminum on the outside, and it's got
Hmm.
a good thermal break.
Yeah.
So I haven't, you know, seen any moisture collect on the interior,
Nice.
and it went through a pretty mild winter last year. But you know, there's things like that to consider when you're planning is you go for something less expensive. What are you sacrificing as a result of that?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think my heating costs while I was building, I've got just a single 2 foot by 4 foot thin ceramic panel radiant heater on the ceiling.
Yep.
My most expensive month was about $26 of
Nice.
electricity for that thing.
Cool. So the radiant panel, is that is the idea there that you heat the people and the objects rather than the air?
Yeah, yeah, it's an infrared heat, and so it feels like it's like the when you walk under it, it's like the difference between standing in the shade and walking under the sun.
Uh-huh.
You really feel it kind of being absorbed by your clothing and
Yeah.
skin. It's so comfortable.
That's
It's very
nice.
gentle, and I can leave the thermostat set to about 62 degrees and it will feel like it's 70
Hmm.
um when you're
Fascinating.
in that space. Yeah, it's great.
And they're not terrible electricity hogs either.
No, not at all. This one is 450 watts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, would a system like that be able to like keep your pipes from freezing in the winter, or would like, I'm kind of envisioning, okay, I'm in Vermont, it's like 0 degrees outside. If I wanted to go that route in my tiny
Mhm.
house or in a future tiny house, would I still need to bring basically warm air into the cabinets to keep my plumbing warm?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've got, simple, inexpensive thermometers that I have
Yeah.
around the the space just to sort of monitor those kinds of things.
Right.
Probably by the time we get around to next winter, when I actually do have
Mm-hmm.
stuff in my cabinets, I'll have to I'll have to verify that. But I've kept the cabinet design very simple, and
Yep.
instead of putting hardware for pulls, I routed out a, a, a hole so that you can grab it with your hand.
Cool.
So there's room for airflow in that design.
That's cool.
So that's one of the
Yeah.
things I was thinking about. Yeah.
Neat. Neat. Is there any, I mean, I'm assuming since you are going to live there, you will have some kind of kitchen as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's actually quite a large kitchen for a tiny house.
Yeah.
It's 10 feet of counter space.
Nice.
Um, it's a little L shape, and I think the kitchen is about a third of the whole tiny house right now.
Yeah.
Because there's little opportunities, like if you slide the composting toilet
Mm-hmm.
back a little bit, then you've got space over the back of it to build like a little slide in pantry
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and that sort of thing. And like the apartment style refrigerator is lifted off the floor, so there's more space underneath it. So I kind of thought about like how to like Tetris myself into this place, because I am really big into cooking, and that was a big consideration.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in terms of a sleep space, is there a loft?
No loft. It's a sofa
Mm-hmm.
that pulls out, and I haven't built that yet.
Okay.
So the mattresses fold up. They're little futon mattresses that are 3.5 inches thick.
Uh-huh.
They've got a latex core, so they're really, really firm but supportive.
Hmm.
And so the sofa can pull out in a configuration where you've got a single or both pulled out, and
Cool.
it's essentially it's called a stow, the size of it. But when both of them are pulled out, it's the size of a queen size bed.
Nice.
And then if I wanted to have another guest sleep over, they could sleep in the nook as well as long as they're under 5 feet.
So is that who makes that sofa? That sounds like ideal for a tiny house.
Oh, the mattress itself was made by White Lotus company in New Jersey,
Okay.
and all of the stuff that they do is either natural fibers,
Uh-huh.
and then you also have the option to do or fully organic as well.
Cool. Oh, okay, so then you're just building the actual pull out
The
mechanism,
frame,
the
yeah,
frame.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Nice. Well, very cool. I've enjoyed the photos that I've seen. You posted to Facebook, and you've shared some with me as well that I'll put on the show notes page for the episode so people can take a look.
great.
There was actually another concept that I think you shared on your Facebook page that I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
And I'll read your caption. What if a carbon neutral tiny house made from prefabricated CLT cross laminated timber could be assembled in a weekend with the interior ready to move in and insulated panels attached to the exterior in a day? Designed in 30 minutes on an iPad, this 120 square foot loft could be your next home, office, or studio. Cool.
I know. I was just kind of horsing around with
Yeah.
I was using a tool called Formit by Autodesk,
Okay.
and I've been a big fan of that for a while. It's sort of a competitor to SketchUp, if you will.
Okay. Like it's a little
But
it's
you can,
simpler.
yeah, a lot less tools,
Yeah.
but it's very powerful,
Nice.
and it works in conjunction with the professional tools that I use.
Right. Yeah.
So the idea behind that, and initially it started off as an April Fool's joke, but as I got into it, I was like, you know what, I could probably do like 10 of these in an hour, and I just like made a copy of it, and I made a couple other designs that I haven't quite shared yet.
Nice.
But there's this trend right now where we're trying to get away from, you know, a lot of the materials that go into, we were talking about just now, the systems that go into building my walls.
Yeah.
It involves a lot of different suppliers, a lot of different costs, a lot of labor.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we can make our buildings more sustainable is looking for renewable resources to put into them. And so
Hmm.
cross laminated timber construction has been very popular in Europe for a number of years, and it's only really just starting to take off in the US because the cost of concrete and steel are rising, and their carbon footprints are
Really
massive.
high. Yeah.
When you build with wood, it's carbon positive because the trees sequester carbon while they're growing, and as long as you don't burn it, that carbon stays there.
Hmm.
So there's a number of factories that are popping up, kind of mom and pop shops that can do cross laminated timber construction, and some of them are more advanced than others, but it's essentially like a large sheet of plywood if you
Hmm.
think about it that way. And I've toured some of these in the past where it just gets tilted up with a crane,
Yeah.
and then you've got your interior finishes are done. You don't have to think about them beyond that.
The interior walls are done. They're just wood.
They're just wood, yeah, and you can seal them, you can paint them, you can do whatever you want with them. And generally, the windows and doors are already installed in those panels when they're tilted up.
Okay.
So to weatherproof them, they're either spray applied with a waterproofing membrane.
Hmm.
You then finish them out like you would a typical rain screen system.
Hmm.
And so it's very fast.
Yeah.
It could, with scale, with a factory that could build these things, because the machining equipment doesn't really care about how complex those cuts are.
Right.
It's just a matter of how many cuts does it have to make and how quickly can it produce panels in an hour. As it, kind of rolls through, if it's very optimized, the cost of construction could drop significantly. So you get
Yeah.
that benefit, and you also get the environmental impact as well. But I suppose the downside of that is we've got to make sure that that lumber is harvested sustainably as well. You
Yeah.
can't just clear cut an entire forest.
Right. Right. I think I even had someone on the show who builds with CLTs. Um, how does insulation work? Because the solid wood, or it's not solid wood, but the cross laminated timber
Mm-hmm.
probably doesn't have much insulation value on its own.
Yeah, there's a couple of different systems that are out there. One is it's solid timber. Usually it's 3 layers
Uh huh.
glued together.
Okay.
But some of them are more like SIPs.
Okay.
So there's actually a panel of insulation in between. And, I've kind of, I think it just depends on the use
Yeah.
and what's available in the area.
Mm-hmm.
They're both good systems. But I think by focusing on moving all of the insulation to the exterior, you get lots of benefits for, sound reduction, for moisture reduction. Yeah, everything that gets generated inside stays inside,
Uh huh.
and the panel kind of like, acclimatizes to that.
Yeah.
So I think it's great that because it's really reducing the complexity of
Yeah.
construction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they look really cool, and it's something that I'm excited to see be applied to tiny houses.
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
imagine they're quite heavy, so maybe not tiny houses on trailers.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm
Um,
probably with the heavy kind of like layers of all the different interventions of systems that I've put on this one. I'm probably pretty close to my weight limit on the trailer.
do you plan to get it weighed?
Like most people, I'm like, no, no, just don't tell me.
Yeah, I've never weighed my house.
Yeah, there is a weigh station nearby, and uh, yeah,
Yeah,
I'll take it on country roads
yeah, yeah. Well, it's
if I
always the
have.
thing is like, okay, if it is in fact 10,000 pounds, like I'm sure you don't own a vehicle that can move it. Maybe you do, but
No, no.
so it's a big deal to move a tiny house. It's not just like, oh, I think I'll take the tiny down to the scales today.
You have to like,
Disconnect stuff.
yeah, you have to be willing to take a lot of risks.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, because moving the previous one was a sketchy situation to say the least.
yeah. Oh,
It was a
well, yeah,
friend. Yeah, it was a friend who moved it, and they had a Suburban, which is basically a 3/4 ton capacity, and it was struggling
yeah,
to stop that trailer on some hills. Yeah.
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 Wow, that's a little scary.
Anyway,
Anyhow,
make sure you hire a professional.
yes, yes, and that your trailer has brakes.
Yes.
Um, well, Sean Burke, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
One thing that I just like to ask all my guests when applicable is, do you have any book or other resource recommendations on design or tiny house building, or just anything that's inspired you lately that you can share with our audience?
Wow. I will say it's not a book, but there's a company in Europe called Codicima. They've been around for a number of years, but they're really mature now. So they've got like 5 different models Their first one that they built was it's about 350 to 400 square feet,
Hmm.
and it's prefabricated in a factory, similar to what we were talking about. Trying to reduce the costs, make these things really accessible, plug and play, if you will.
Yeah.
And then they came out with a wood version of that. That's CLT and more well insulated, but it's also much lighter to transport.
Hmm.
They've put them on barges. They've put them, on properties all around Europe and the UK. And
Nice.
I stayed in one in Tallinn, which was fantastic. It was a little like hotel, if you will, that they set up temporarily in a parking lot. It was very, very comfortable.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So I'll give you the link to that if
Yeah.
you haven't
Please
found it.
do. Please do. It's always interesting. Like, I love looking to Europe and seeing the building things that they're doing there, because it seems like they got on board with sustainability requirements a lot
Yeah. Yeah.
before we did. And yet, like, the tiny house movement in the, the sense that we're talking about it, like little houses built on trailers, is much more developed here in
Mm.
terms of the legal landscape and the sheer numbers of people who are doing it. And so it's like, it's almost, there could be some symbiosis.
Yeah. I think on the other scale of things, there are some small companies. There's a company in my city where I live now in Everett, Washington, called Pallet.
Yeah.
They make shelters for the homeless,
Hmm.
and they're super simple, like aluminum and fiberglass. They're not the most attractive, but they are really functional, and
Hmm.
they've kept their costs extremely low, so that if charities or government organizations want to buy a bunch of these to help get people, off the streets and into something that's safe and, with dignity,
Neat.
it's much better than sleeping in a tent.
Yeah.
So there's those options, and then there's a company in California called Jupe that I'm following now.
Hmm.
That was started by Professor Dumpster.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a tent on a platform.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of interesting to see because if you can build the platform to be modular, then whatever goes on top of it could be different
Yeah.
depending on what your needs are.
Neat.
So that's a really cool thing to keep an eye on. Kind of like if Apple was designing tiny homes, that would
Yeah.
be, yeah.
Cool. Well, those are two more great recommendations to check out, and as always, everything that we've talked about, as long as I can find it, will be on the show notes page for this episode. And I'm gonna bug you. I'm gonna try to get you to send me a diagram of your wall system
Yes.
so that people can visualize it.
I actually have some detailed
Cross section. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
My website is kind of in development right now still,
Okay.
but it'll go live in the next few weeks, and I'll be teasing more details from the project,
Cool.
and eventually I'll sell plans if someone wanted to build another one similar to it. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, Sean Burke, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. This was a great conversation.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you so much to Sean Burke for being a guest on the show today. As always, you can find a complete transcript for this episode, links to Sean's website, and images of the Bento Studio at thetinyhouse.net/174. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/174. Well, that's all for this week. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.